evening and welcome to the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. The long pending verdict on the AGR case is finally out. That's the big story that we're talking about this evening on the India Development Debate. Why is the Supreme Court verdict so crucial? Well, it will determine whether one of the three remaining major players in the country in the telecom sector survive. That is Vodafone Idea. It will also, in a sense, impact the big question on whether telecom tariffs will go up. We're going to be discussing that in just a short while from now, but we're also going to be talking about some very interesting high frequency data in the economy. We've been talking about all the gloom and doom so far with the largest ever quarterly contraction in the GDP, but auto numbers have given some sign of optimism. So has manufacturing data, which is the highest in 5 months. Could things be turning around? And in the India Revival Mission Special today, we talk to experts from the healthcare sector. After all, healthcare will be the key to reviving India. But first, let's get to the big story on AGR. AGR, you've probably heard that term several times in the last few weeks in connection with a Supreme Court verdict which had to decide how much time telecom companies have to pay long pending dues which run into thousands of crores. This is a fight that has been going on between telecom companies and the government for nearly 20 years now. In October last year, the Supreme Court made it clear that the government's version of AGR was the one that they would go with. Today, they have decided that companies have 10 years to pay up. Before we move ahead, let's take a look at exactly what AGR is and what this case was all about.
The 16-year battle on how AGR is defined has finally ended, leaving the fate of Vodafone Idea and the telecom sector hanging in the balance. The entire dispute boils down to how telecom companies defined AGR or adjusted gross revenues. Telecom companies have to share a percentage of their earnings with the government as per their agreement. The question was, what accounts for total revenue and hence, how much would the government's share be? While the government said it includes all revenues from both telecom and non-telecom services, the companies felt it should include revenue earned from core services, that's telecom services only. In October 2019, this part of the debate was laid to rest by the Supreme Court that upheld the government's version of how AGR is defined. This meant telecom companies would have to cough up dues of over 1.6 lakh crores, which includes license fees, spectrum usage charges, interest and penalties. While Reliance Jio is the least affected player, Bharti Airtel has to pay over 35,000 crores and Vodafone over 53,000 crores. Now this came as bad news especially for Vodafone Idea, which was already struggling under a strained balance sheet and mounting debt payments. In fact, Vodafone Idea has said that they would not survive if they had to make this payment without some leeway. The court has now decided companies will get 10 years to pay up and have to pay 10% of what they owe by the 31st of March 2021. Companies wanted at least 15 years but have to now find a way to pay up and survive at the same time.
As far as the government was concerned, they were willing to give us 20 years. Some Vodafone asked for 15. But I think now there is finality and clarity. They've given us 10 years and 10% upfront payment.
Vodafone was keen to carry on with its operations in India, and therefore we requested for 15-20 years. But the court, it appears, has given us 10 years, which in the current scenario is not bad. It's definitely okay, but one will have to read the judgment because it has many other issues in it. But my initial reaction is that Vodafone will survive with 10 years and so on.
While Jio has cleared its dues of 195 crores, Vodafone Idea has paid over 13% of its dues till date and Airtel has cleared 41%. With Shivangani Mishra, Mubina Kapasi in Mumbai for ET Now.
I have with me Sanjay Kapoor, former CEO of Bharti Airtel. I'm also speaking with R. Chandrashekhar, former DOT Secretary, and Tushad Kapoor, Senior Counsel. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for talking with us today on this very, very big day. Mr. Kapoor, let me begin with your take. Now, I've been hearing your comments all day, and you've spoken also about what you think of the verdict. Just on the three basic questions I've asked, do you think Vodafone Idea will first of all survive? And this matters from every perspective, because then we also will understand whether we have a duopoly in this market.
Good evening, Tamanna, and good evening to the viewers. Yes, indeed, a very important day on AGR issue, which has been lingering on for a very long time. I think the situation was so precarious that it was a decision between a company dropping dead or a company getting a fair chance to look at future and see are there any survival strategies that they can operate on to have some lease of life. And if you look at it from three stakeholders' viewpoint who are involved, there are customers who are involved, there was government that was involved, and then there was the operator that was involved. If there was a drop-dead decision, it would have been a disaster for the customers, because the 2G and 3G customers would have virtually been facing a disastrous monopoly because there's only one other large operator. Of course, BSNL, MTNL have 2G, 3G spectrum, but they're very small in the market, and there would have been one single large dominant operator. So I don't think that would have been good for those customers. If you look at from the government's perspective, the government would have had to write off all their dues from Vodafone Idea Limited, and that wouldn't have worked in anybody's favor, especially given the results on the economic indices that got announced yesterday. And finally, for Vodafone Idea, of course, they would have had to shut shop. It wouldn't have been any great morale booster for them or others who want to come into this country. So I think any which way you look at it, this 10-year period seems to be some lease of life, and for a few reasons. First of all, in the 10 years, I think now Vodafone Idea have an opportunity to see what game do they want to play. I think they have already given up their aspirations, it seems, to be a number one player. And if they are not the number one player and compete for a second or third spot in the market, they could be having a very different strategy, a truncated coverage, more focused on profits with lesser customer base, and also really decide on what services to have and what services not to have, maybe sunset their 3G and 2G faster than envisaged earlier, or vice versa. They could work on something. Now the question arises, what happens to the monies that are required? Because they're going to pay a large amount of money to the government, and then they need survival kit as well, which is one, to make sure they stay contemporary and competitive with other operators, because they have to play a catch-up game. And secondly, they need more funds for future, especially 5G staring at us. We can only delay it, we cannot wish it away. Now, considering these options, obviously debt or equity, that's how they can get into it. Given the current circumstances and their balance sheets, debt looks very unlikely. And even if it was to come, it will really tight jacket the whole process, because the governance will be so hard on them that I don't think they'll be able to function the way they want to. Therefore, the real choice is equity. And equity is a game of risk and reward. Given the current risk which is associated with the company, there could be a huge reward as well. Because if you look at their valuations and compare it with Airtel or with Jio, I mean, they're far, far apart. So it could be a multi-bagger if the game strikes right over the next 10 years period. So I think any which way you look at, and raising the prices, I think was not directly linked to this decision. It's only got accentuated by this decision. The rates have to go up. There is no way a country our size with $2 per customer. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Can I complete the sentence? I mean,
let me come to the question of tariffs in a little.
Sure.
Yes. Sure. That's a fair point, Mr. Kapoor. And let me come to the question of tariffs in a little more detail ahead in the conversation. I laid out the three major questions in the beginning of this discussion. And yes, the primary one continues to be what happens to this market. Let me come now to the legal part of the question, to Mr. Tushad Cooper. Mr. Cooper, the court didn't have a very easy choice because if you go through the judgment as well, there were many representations, including from the Indian Banking Association, which listed out the harm of any kind of decision which would cause one of the players to shut shop, the impact it would have for consumers, the impact it would have on future spectrum, etc. Do you think, all things considered, the court has come to a decision which will, in a sense, please all? It will allow the government to get its dues and will also allow a chance of survival to all of the players, especially to Vodafone Idea?
Okay. Yes, I do think the court has attempted to strike a balance. The quantum of the dues was already quantified, and the court has negated any plea to have that quantum reduced in any form whatsoever. The quantum itself of 50,000 crores or thereabouts on Vodafone is a huge amount. How would Vodafone meet this demand? Vodafone had undoubtedly sought 15 to 20 years. The court has granted 10. It may be possible for Vodafone to pay off the arrears in 10 years. But as has rightly been pointed out earlier by one of the panelists, the question is, for this to happen, it would either have to increase its debt or raise equity. Undoubtedly, the risk reward would favor an equity investor today, but the risk would be commensurately much larger. Given the fact that in all probability, the consumers of or the customers of Vodafone would probably migrate for a stabler regime to Airtel or Jio, the consumers of Vodafone would probably be likely to drift away. If they drifted away, it would be a double whammy for Vodafone. One, they would have to increase tariffs, which would further incentivize customers leaving Vodafone to migrate to Jio, whose pocket is slightly deeper and could sustain the losses in the interregnum. So Vodafone is in a very precarious situation. I agree that the court took a right approach in trying to preserve a non-duopoly, in trying to encourage multiple players to survive, and to that end did grant a larger period of time for payment of these dues. But whether that extended period of time of 10 years would be sufficient, I'm not so sure. And apparently, market investors apparently also seem to subscribe to that if one were to look at the fall in the share price of Vodafone today. So that's my view on the question as to whether Vodafone would survive. And yes, the judgment was to that extent fairly balanced and nuanced.
Mr. Cooper, there has been a sort of different set of views all day today on whether telecom companies can go back and ask for some kind of a review. Should they be doing that? The judgment makes it very clear that in terms of the AGR dues, there will be no dispute and no reassessment. That's in fact point number one. But in terms of the duration, the 10 years, do you think that in your view, if any of these companies will go back to the court and ask for a review, would that even be in the realm of possibility, considering that one of the judges who have delivered this judgment will now be retiring tomorrow?
Well, on the possibility of a review, undoubtedly the right subsists. It is always open to a party to seek a review of the judgment. It is also true that one of the judges who had delivered the judgment, Justice Arun Mishra, will be retiring, and therefore the review would necessarily take place before the two other judges and a third new judge who would be appointed. The new bench would be constituted with another third judge. You are right. I don't believe that the review will have a chance of any success at all on the quantum of dues, which have been repeated and reiterated as being final. On the question of time, perhaps another bench may be inclined to soften its stance, given the stance which was adopted by the government itself, which for various reasons, and perhaps rightly so, wanted to give a longer time for payment of these dues. However, I must say that normally review petitions do not succeed. It is extremely, extremely rare for a review petition to succeed. So it's not very likely, but yes, theoretically it is possible.
Mr. Chandrashekhar, I'm sure you want to begin by talking about the impact on the industry and, what it means really for the telecom sector going ahead. And please do start with that. But I also want to get your perspective, if I may, on what this whole episode has said about the sometimes fraught relationship between governments and telecom companies. I mean, in this case, it was the government that doggedly pursued AGR dues for several years. When they had a judgment in their favor, then, the DOT has realized that it might mean sinking one of the three remaining players. They themselves have gone ahead and said, okay, we are okay with giving 20 years. The court says, no, only 10. What does it really tell you about how this relationship has gone forward, and what kind of a precedent does it set, just as this whole sector continues to explode?
Good evening to everyone. And that's a very important question, Tamanna. The question, I think, needs to be looked at from a very different perspective, in my opinion. And that is that, it's not only the question of the relationship between the government and the telcos, it's also a question of the milieu and the climate in the country within which these decisions need to be taken. At the time when the government decided to appeal against the ruling of the TDSAT, which went in favor of the telcos, if the government had taken an executive decision not to go in appeal, then that was a time when the likely headlines would have been that government gives a 93,000 crore gift to the telcos. That was the atmosphere, that was the climate that was prevailing at that point in time. And therefore, the government chose, quite logically, to leave it to the courts to decide, file an appeal, and then get a final judicial pronouncement from the highest court in the land. We should also bear in mind that the original AGR definition was made in a very different set of circumstances 15 years ago, when it was actually a struggle to get people to bid or to take up licenses. It was a struggle to really get them to expand and so on. And the definition of AGR at that time was, the whole idea was to keep it very simple. And telcos really were basically just in the telco business, and non-telco revenues were a very small fraction or almost insignificant fraction. So the definition really was all embracing, and from a technical point of view, therefore, the Supreme Court was right in deciding the way that it did. So it has gone by the letter of the law and the letter of the agreement between the telcos and the government. And that is how legal decisions are taken, whereas policy decisions and executive decisions are taken on a much broader set of parameters, which might include the health of the sector and the particular interventions that are required. But in any case, I think, so this is not, in my view, as much a reflection of changing relationship between the government and the telcos as it is of the changing climate in which the economy is in and the government and the telcos are operating in. But either way, the court ruling has, given a finality to this particular issue, and we are where we are, and the consequences of that obviously have many ramifications, and some of which have been discussed just now. So that's my sort of view on how this reflects on the relationship between them, as well as the broader canvas. Tamanna?
I want to come to one of those consequences which Mr. Kapoor spoke of earlier in his initial response. And Mr. Kapoor, you talked about very emphatically, and this is something you've said in the past as well, that in a country the size of India, you can't have ARPUs which are so dismal and low. Essentially, we can't get away with such cheap services that we enjoy, some of the lowest rates in the world. But honestly, Mr. Chandrashekhar made a very important point right now about climate, about perception, and those kind of factors which influence policy making. Are rising tariffs a fallout that the government of the day, in the middle of a pandemic, in one of the worst, quarterly GDP contractions ever, is it something anyone will want to see? Number one. And number two, players will be on board and play ball. One of the players has sort of made its mark by undercutting and charging less than anyone else. Where is the stake for everyone to agree to an increase in prices?
Let me try and answer both the parts of your question. First of all, telecom is not a vertical anymore. Telecom is a horizontal industry that runs across all sectors in the business. Today, no matter what business you run, whether as a professional or as an organized business or unorganized business, you need telecommunications to conduct your business, more so during the COVID times. And the way telecom is to be looked upon now, and connectivity and access needs to be looked upon now, is that you are not using it like earlier days only for entertainment or connectivity. You're using it for education, you're using it for health, you're using it work from home and work from anywhere. So the whole connotation of the service has to undergo a change. And are you saying a household that does all these things is not conducive to be paying $5 or $6 for this service every month? I'll be very surprised. That's one. Second thing, it's not about you as an individual or an industry. It's also about the country and its competitiveness. We, on the physical side of infrastructure, are not as reliant as we are on the virtual side of infrastructure, where we've built a very contemporary highway which competes very well with the rest of the world. Now, if our services and the experiences don't match up with the rest of the world, we will really jostle to compete with the rest of the world. So I think it's in our interest. And if technologies are going to change every 4 years and 5 years, how do you expect anybody to absorb that over a 10-year depreciation or amortization? It's not going to work. So somebody has to pay the price. If the customer doesn't pay the price, then the government probably should subsidize. If the government cannot subsidize, then what's the option? You think a business can subsidize and shut down? That is what will happen, which has been happening to 10 other companies who went, virtually for bankruptcy. We don't want that to happen. We want a healthy, sustainable industry, which gives a very competitive experience to our customers and on all facets of life, not just entertainment or connectivity, basic connectivity. That's one. To answer your second question, I agree. There are phases in the life of any company. You see, in the first phase, when a new challenger was coming into the market, probably when he's setting up his network, pricing becomes a very powerful tool. And that's how any new entrant enters any market of telecommunications globally. I'm associated with several people across the globe on telecommunications, and I can tell you, the person with the cheapest price doesn't become the market leader. Ultimately, the guy who has the best customer experience retains the market leadership. The investment that has got, the sort of market aberrations that they have, I think it is time for them to change gears as well, to move from price to experience. Price can be replicated even by a weak player in the market, but experience cannot be replicated, because for that you need time, you need capability, you need resources. And I think it's time that Jio will change gears. I'll be very surprised if they don't, because their whole stuff is about the 360-degree digital services, all-encompassing, move from 4G to 5G. If that's the play, it'll move on to a very different plane of customer experience, which will obviously need more prices to come on the table. At $2, $3, you see, the world over, the third operator, even in high ARPU markets of $10, $15, $20, struggles to make money. It's not easy to make money in this business because it's very capital intensive. It's also operationally very expensive. And if we are going to move to 5G eventually, what is 5G? It's about higher speed, low latency, Internet of Things. You need a great amount of backhaul on fiber. You need 100 megs of spectrum. You need use cases. If you don't have people who are going to pay the price of those services, how will those services be sustainable? 6G will be staring at you before you probably roll out 5G completely. And if you're going to be talking about low latency can only work when the coverage blackouts are zero, which means there's a blemishless coverage everywhere. Where are we there? We are not there. So those investments can only happen if there's a price paid for those services or the government subsidizes. Choose. But it cannot come out of thin air or fresh air. It cannot happen. So I guess, the market leader, if Jio is the market leader, I am sure with the new monies that have come in, with the new collaborations, they will change gears to customer experience.
So let me take off on that, change gears to customer experience, and that's very interesting. Mr. Chandrashekhar, let me come to you, in fact, for a perspective on where the industry is heading. Now, for a Vodafone Idea or for any player that really wants to survive and thrive in this business, is it going to be enough to be the cheapest? Is it going to be important to be everywhere, including in rural areas? Is it going to be important to be the first with 5G? Or is it going to be a game of a better experience, a more premium product?
Well, first of all, I agree with all the points which Mr. Sanjay Kapoor made. But I think that there are one or two additional factors which may need to be considered from all the very good points that he had made. Now, this is, at the end of the day, a competitive business. And there are right now 3 players and a public sector undertaking. And let us leave aside BSNL for a moment and focus on the 3 private players. While the judgment applies equally to all 3 of them, it is very well known that the impact of the judgment is huge as far as Vodafone Idea is concerned, significant as far as Bharti is concerned, and peripheral as far as Jio is concerned. Now, that has a lot of implications for what price point of the services makes it comfortable and profit generating for each of these companies. And that is, of course, apart from the difference in terms of 2G and 3G being provided only by 2 of the players and Jio being entering only with the 4G services. So that's, I think, a very important differentiator between all the 3. So a price point which, can comfortably be sustained by Jio may not be a price point at which Vodafone can sustain themselves, even assuming for a moment that both are providing a similar price quality for their services. So a lot of it will depend on the competitive strategies. And you yourself referred to in the question that, there have been certain approaches in the past and these have had consequences in terms of consolidation. So what are the strategies which would be adopted by each of the players? How they would look at consolidation? Would they see the need to continue having the 3 players, or would they, prefer to drive the market to a point where it becomes a duopoly in effect? And I think everyone would be doing their calculations and would know how much pressure can be applied through recourse to what business strategy. So I would not want to go into the business strategy. That is certainly not something that, is my sort of area of competence. But it's very clear from all of these facts that much would depend not only on the ability of the market to pay. And once again, as Mr. Kapoor said, as people avail of more and more high value services, the cost of the telecom services becomes a small fraction of the overall healthcare or education or whatever service you are availing of, or entertainment. And therefore, the affordability also goes up. as new technologies come in, the price point that is needed to make it a viable business and hopefully also a profitable business also will keep changing. So all these shifts would be taking place, but superimposed on that is the competitive strategies, the differential impact on each of these companies, and how they would look at these issues, not only from their own perspective, but how they would like to play, what kind of a position they would like to put the competition in. So I think all of these are related questions. And to that extent, I would say that your first question of will Vodafone survive, and the second question of will a rise in rates be inevitable, are interrelated, because it's a question of when that rise in rates will come in and whether Vodafone Idea would find it attractive enough to either get loan funding or would be willing to, or would have equity investors who are willing to invest in it. So all these are to some extent related questions, and that's a dynamic which will be difficult to predict.
Absolutely. I must end this here because I'm running out of time, but I want to thank all of you for joining us on the discussion this evening. And I just want to end by saying that, maybe it is time we re-look at the value of this service in our lives when we are gauging how much people will be willing to pay for it. It is no longer just roti kapda makan, which is the requirement of the Aam Aadmi or the average Indian. It's definitely roti kapda makan or Wi-Fi. So in that sense, maybe it's going to be a whole new ball game. With that, I want to thank all of you for joining us on the first big discussion.